I'm Hale, co-director of the CPC-Connecting Generations. This is one of the seminars where we present ongoing research in the centre. And I'm very pleased to welcome and introduce Professor Nissa Finney from St Andrews. Most of you know Nissa very well by her reputation, so let me just briefly say that Nissa's research interests are related to the study of migration, residential segregation, and ethnicity. She's well known for her research on ethnic residential segregation and for recent studies on age segregation. The underlying to all this research is to gain a better understanding of inequalities in our societies, how they emerge, what are the mechanisms behind them. Nissa is also an expert of mixed methods. Today, Nissa is going to present ongoing work within the CPC-Connecting Generations Community Resilience and Social Coherence project. How resilient are different neighborhoods demographically? So this is a main question I understand Nissa poses and provides an answer. So welcome, Nissa. The floor is yours via the screen.
Thank you very much, Hale, for your kind introduction, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. So today I want us to think about how intergenerational relations happen in place. What makes a place good in terms of the intergenerational relations? And I want to think about this particularly from a population or community level rather than an individual or interpersonal level. And in this presentation, I'm going to do that by focusing on ideas and empirical material around age mixing in place. And as Hale said, this is ongoing work. So this is the first outing for much of this work as part of the CPC Connecting Generations programme. And it's very much a collaboration between members of the project team. So me, Alice Butler, Rachel Wilkie, Qiong, Elspeth Graham and Joe Hale. And some of those colleagues are here with us this afternoon. So the idea of resilience has really become extremely widespread, not only in academic settings, but in non-academic settings in recent years. And the idea of resilience relies on a sense of threat, that there's something there that we need to respond to, that we need to be prepared for. So there's a presumption of an ongoing or permanent threat. And in the case of this presentation, we can see that threat as ageing populations. And resilience is very widely used across disciplines with quite varying emphases for different subdisciplines on how resilience is conceptualized and the emphasis that is placed on aspects of social, environmental, demographic, or place resilience and others too. And the ideas of resilience really have quite a lot of overlap, though they're not necessarily discussed alongside ideas of sustainability and cohesion in terms of place. But these ideas are not altogether uncontested. So while resilience can be seen as having transformative potential for people and places, it can also be seen as a means of securitizing or disciplining society. So resilience discourses have been critiqued, for example, by defining resilience external to communities' definitions and by neglecting the capitalist social relations that underpin inequalities. So I am going to use the terminology of resilience in this presentation, but bearing in mind these very interesting critiques that do exist. So our focus is on population mix and community resilience. And the starting point is that geography matters and neighbourhood matters, as many people have written on. And the idea of place resilience has long been evident in place-based policies and has a very contemporary expression in planning frameworks, including the current planning frameworks for Scotland. And narratives of mix are very much embedded in thinking on what constitutes a desirable local population. So mixing is seen as good predominantly. For example, there's a desirability of having a class mix, and that underpins mixed housing initiatives, and racial mix is seen as desirable and underpins social cohesion and migrant settlement policies. And if we look to the gerontology and sociological literature on ageing in place, we see that although this emphasises the needs and experiences of older people, there's a clear recognition that age-inclusive places are the goal. So to be attentive to the mix of population, not just older people. Theories on social mix from a social perspective tend, I would say, to emphasize interpersonal relations, including those theoretical perspectives that come from a social capital framing. And they see these interpersonal relations as the main mechanism through which benefit is accrued. We gain benefits from mixing with people like us and also people not like us. On the other hand, we have theories from a demographic or population point of view that position age mix as desirable in terms of the balance of population in relation to dependency and population reproduction, and balance both socially and economically. And I would say that we very rarely get an overlap of these theories of social mix and demographic mix, and that's part of the points we want to think about today. How can we bring into conversation these ideas of social mix and demographic mix? So what we're trying to do in the study more broadly is work towards a concept of intergenerational community resilience that emphasises the demographic as well as the social dimension of resilience, that takes account of the scalar and relational nature of community, how people and places are connected with others beyond their own place. That also accounts for how local actors are reclaiming practices and discourses of resilience, and that places equity and sustainability at the centre of understanding community resilience. But that's a lot of very big ideas and too much for one lunchtime seminar. So we're going to work with these broader ideas today by focusing in on ideas and questions of local age mixing. So firstly, we'll think about what are the geographies of local age mixing and how are they changing? And if we take the assumption that age mix constitutes resilience, where might resilience of neighbourhoods be under threat? And secondly, through what routes and relations can the building of resilient community intergenerational relations be observed to exist? Our focus for this work that I'm presenting today is on Scotland, which is a really interesting context for these questions because of the very severely and rapidly ageing population, because of very salient government concerns about the sustainability of populations and action plans related to that. And Scotland's also interesting because the population is very uneven in its distribution from remote rural areas to large urban centres, and also in its economic development. So there are some very high pockets of high deprivation, which have been for a long time a policy focus. Today I'm going to present both large-scale and small-scale data, because in this project we're taking very deliberately, very intentionally a mixed methods approach and really trying to integrate the mixing of different approaches, different data, different ways of working into all stages of the research. So at a large scale, you're going to see analyses of census data for Scotland from 2011 and 2022, and we're using two indicators here for small areas. The index of dissimilarity to show age segregation, and using Simpson's index, we've produced an age diversity index. The small areas that we're using, that we're working with, are data zones, which we can think of as being neighbourhoods. There's on average around 800 people in each data zone. And in some of the results that I present, I'll present this in terms of urban-rural categories across Scotland. At the small scale, we are in the relatively early stages of qualitative work in a case study site in Dundee, which is close to us here in St Andrews, a neighbourhood called Stobswell. And there we're doing a variety of methods, interviews, walking interviews, visual methods, workshops with stakeholders and with residents of the area. And I'm going to introduce the area in a bit more detail in a moment. But first, let's come to our first research question for today, which is about the changing geographies of local age mix in Scotland. First, let's consider the distribution of Scotland's population geographically and how this has changed over the last decade. So the lines on this chart show the net changes in the proportions of the population in each of the urban or rural areas indicated between these two census points, this decade of 2011 to 2022. So we can see that from the blue line that over this period, Scotland's population distribution overall for the total population has shifted from urban areas and accessible small towns. We see those blue dots there at the left-hand side of below the zero line indicating a net loss. And there's been a net gain to rural areas, particularly accessible rural areas. And the red line shows that the shift looks somewhat different for the older population. So the red line is for population older than 65. And we see here that large urban areas at the very far left have lost older population proportionately, and accessible rural areas in particular have gained older population over this decade. And the green line at the top tells us that all of this change is in the context of percentage increases in the older population across all areas and area types of Scotland. So that's the big picture to bear in mind, and we're going to gradually now, throughout the rest of this presentation, reduce our scale that we're looking at. Here I have two charts that indicate local age mix. And on the left, we have the dissimilarity index and index of residential segregation. The higher the index, the greater the residential separation or unevenness between the younger and older age groups that we're considering. On the right, we have a diversity index, which gives us an indication of the mix of ages, whether or not the whole range of age groups are represented in the population of those areas and how this has changed over time. An increase in that index indicates a greater representation of ages. So for the left-hand chart, you can see in the key that a blue line indicates decreased segregation for that area type, urban or rural area classification, and a red line indicates increased segregation. For the diversity chart, or age diversity chart on the right hand side, a red line is a decrease and a blue line is increase. So conceptually, in the framing that we're taking in this presentation, blue can be seen as good, blue can be seen as good reduced age segregation and increased age diversity. So what can we say about these patterns of mixing across the urban-rural areas of Scotland? Well, first of all, for the urban areas, for the large urban areas and the other urban areas, we see a decrease in age segregation in the left-hand chart and an increase in age diversity. So here we have greater mixing in the neighbourhoods in urban areas in Scotland over this decade. Over time, people living in these places would have had opportunity to mix more with people of other ages from themselves. Accessible small towns and rural areas show a different picture. We have increased segregation and increasing diversity. which seems somewhat contradictory. And the way that we can interpret this is that there are more ages being represented in accessible small towns and rural areas, but within those areas there is clustering of people according to age. And then finally we have the remote rural areas and very remote rural areas, which show less age mixing over time on both indicators. So these may be the areas that would raise particular policy concerns as not being socially and demographically resilient. Let's look at the small areas that we've been talking about. These maps are of data zones in Scotland, and this shows diversity in age diversity in 2022. So if we look at the maps, we can see in the map of Scotland on the left-hand side, panel A, that the purple areas, which are the least diverse and getting older, are predominantly in the rural areas of Scotland. And also the borders of Scotland do as well there towards the bottom of that map. But we also have pink areas that are among the least diverse, but these are quite young, quite youthful areas in their age structure. And this is in the urban areas, and particularly that central belt between Glasgow and Edinburgh that we can see in the bottom panel, panel D. And the most age diverse places, most age diverse neighbourhoods in Scotland, shown in the green, are really quite scattered here. We can see them in rural areas, very rural areas, and in proximity to the urban areas. Now, what about the change? This is the overall static picture in 2022, but what is the trend in terms of how these different parts of Scotland are changing their age mix? So here, the areas that had decreased age diversity are shown in purple and blue, and the increased age diversity are in orange and pink. And panel A shows the urban-rural differences that we saw in the charts for segregation and age diversity by area classification. And the insets for Fife, for Aberdeenshire, and for the central belt between Glasgow and Edinburgh really show the heterogeneity when we drill down to this very small scale. So panel B of Fife shows that there are many areas in purple that are decreasing in age diversity at the same time as they're getting older. Somewhat in contrast, panel C for Aberdeenshire is dominated by the orange neighbourhoods, which are getting older but experiencing an increase in age diversity. And panel D, there at the bottom, the central belt between Edinburgh and Glasgow, has many neighbourhoods that are becoming younger with decreased age diversity. So they're getting younger, age diversity is decreasing, and this is the places shown in orange. So one of the pieces of work that we are currently beginning is to look at how these changing local geographies of age diversity are being shaped by migration, particularly internal migration. But that's for another seminar. So let's summarise where we're at so far. Across Scotland, there are varied dynamics of local age mix and geographically uneven demographic resilience. The population's shifted in distribution, the older population, from urban areas to accessible small towns and rural areas. And I haven't shown the data for this here, but accompanying analyses show that over time, a higher proportion of older people have the residential experiences of living in a neighbourhood with a concentration of older people. So increasing isolation, if you like, of older populations. And this segregation, residential segregation between young and old, is highest in large urban areas, though it is decreasing in those areas. And conceptually, we've suggested that we can think about decreasing age diversity as a threat to intergenerational community resilience. Not so much in urban areas where we see age diversity increasing, but very much an issue in this interpretation for remote rural areas where we've seen considerable decreases in age diversity. And then there's the interesting case which needs unpicking of the accessible rural and town neighbourhoods, where we've got an increase in the age diversity, so more mixing of younger and older people, but it seems like within those places there's a clustering of old and young people because we also have increased residential segregation. So in some local matters, we need to pay attention to the heterogeneity of local contexts. So with that in mind, let's turn to our case study of Stobswell in Dundee to think about how this kind of mixing actually might play out in place. What are the roots and relations of community resilience for intergenerationality? First, let me tell you a bit about Stobswell and why we have selected it. It is a ward part of a ward in the east of Dundee, so very proximate, within a mile of the urban centre. And it is a former industrial area, so it's very close to the docks, and there are still some working paper mills there, and historically there have been mills, paper and textile mills. And it was evident from our reviews when we were scoping for a case study location, our first case study location for this project, that there was very strong community identity in Stobswell and community activity. So we chose this site partly for the demographic and socioeconomic characteristics of the place, partly for its proximity to the university, and partly for the potential for what works insights. This is Stobswell. The aerial view in the centre is looking north to the hills. Stobswell is predominantly on the right-hand downward diagonal illuminated street that you see here. If we look south from Stobswell, we look over the River Tay, as you can see in the image at the bottom right-hand side. There is some very significant architecture, Victorian architecture, particularly as in the school, the Morgan Academy, that is at the bottom left-hand side. And the two images at the top left and top right show that there's been an active high street in Stobswell since the 19th century, and it remains still very, very active high street. The population of Stobswell is young. So here we have the population pyramid in blue for Scotland and in orange for Stobswell, and you can see immediately the very high proportions of young people, particularly in the 20s and 30s. It's also a very deprived area, not only of Dundee, but of Scotland. Here we have the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation classifications for areas of Stobswell, and you can see those that are red, orange and pink are in the highest categories, within the 20% most deprived, and some areas within the 5% most deprived areas of Scotland. And in terms of age mixing, Stobswell has low age diversity, as you can see in the top map there. The area bordered in black is the ward in which Stobswell sits, and you can see the pink indicates low diversity with this young age structure. And the bottom map shows change in diversity, which shows that there's been an increase in diversity over this time, and also that this increase in diversity is through Stobswell getting older. So more age groups represented at the same time that this young population is getting older. There are three key findings in what I'm going to present, and then I'm going to move on to illustrating them. And this is from our initial work in Stobswell, which has primarily been scoping conversations with stakeholders and interviews with key community activists and stakeholders. So what we have at the moment doesn't represent any residents' views or experiences. So firstly, from this work, I think it's important to think about intergenerational relations as a byproduct rather than necessarily a focus of community work in this deprived central urban neighbourhood. Secondly, intergenerational relations in Stobswell is in a form of generations alongside rather than deliberate generational intertwining. And this is evident in both the physical and social fabric of the community. And thirdly, the community building and intergenerational trust has taken place over decades in this community. Let me illustrate these findings. First, how is intergenerationality evident in Stobswell's physical environments? Firstly, a key point is the proximity of sites in which we might find people of different ages. So at the right-hand side, we see the images we've already seen, the Morgan Academy, which is at the top of the image, the aerial image. And this shows the very close proximity of the school to the high street and the heart of the community. At least twice a day, also at lunchtime if the teachers don't catch them, lots and lots of young people are walking around the area of Stobswell Centre and the high street. And secondly, an illustration of proximity is in the very left-hand image, where next to this mural we have a residential home for older people, which is in proximity to this pocket garden shown in the image second from left. And both the pocket gardens and the murals have been a major community investment and project over recent years. And they encourage this opportunity in the social infrastructure development of the place for people to be alongside or to mix with one another. Another example of the physical environment representing intergenerational relations is through projects. And this is one example of a piece of art just on the high street, which was designed partly as a safety measure to make parts of this area more welcoming. Remember, this is a very, very deprived area. And this is a mural of Ethel Moorhead, who was a Scottish suffragette who lived for some time in Dundee. And it was a collaboration between local young people and professional artists, supported and organised by the community organisations, the community fora in Stobswell. The second point is that we see intergenerationality in Stobswell in terms of the social infrastructure, the community organisations. So the image at the right is a drawing, our initial attempts at mapping the vast web of community organisations and activists and activities that are happening in Stobswell. And at left we see a notice board from one of the community centres, the Boomerang Centre, that shows provision for toddlers, for example, happening alongside provision for older populations. For example, reminiscences groups. So this is an example of what I mean by intergenerational relations happening alongside one another, not necessarily intermingling or intertwined with one another. And these complex structures of community organisation have really maximised the community's capability to mobilise resources. And the dynamism of that community organisation supports that as well. But perhaps even more important is the length of time that has been invested to developing these community infrastructures, organisations, networks, ways of working. And the Stobswell Forum that produces the Stobswell Voice is a very pertinent example of that, and has been going for over 20 years. And one community activist commented that volunteering or activism has a glass ceiling. There's a limit to what they can do, but it can be a conduit. We can work with the council. We have a good relationship with the police. So these community activists are very skilled at navigating and negotiating the arenas of community development which benefit the community in terms of intergenerational relations. And I want to give just one example of how that is happening in a project that wasn't intended to be about intergenerational relations, but has had a very significant and important effect. And this is what was termed the Youth Diversion Project. And it started as a project aimed at addressing antisocial youth behaviour in the area. And it provides football and social provision at this sports ground, which is a council-run facility and also has an indoor facility for around 200 young people on 4 nights a week. And it's been doing this for 20 years. And this is a collaboration between Dundee City Council, the Stobswell Forum, Dundee United and others. And that collaboration is really vital, as is the length of time across which those relationships have been developed. Then crucially, a more recent development in recent years has been that the scheme, overseen by the forum, the Stobswell Forum, has employed and trained 12 local young people as coaches and leaders each year. So it's empowering these young people in the community. And although there isn't contact directly between these young people and older people in the community, what several of the stakeholders that we've spoken to have told us is that the effect of this project has been to create a sense of intergenerational trust. So this quote epitomizes that: local young people funded by local people, older people, in a very tangible way. A trust has been built up through that. And our participants have spoken about this trust being both ways. So the fear of antisocial behaviour has diminished. The young people feel valued and empowered, feel closer to the older people. The older people feel less fearful of the younger people and the risk of antisocial behaviour. And another comment that emphasised the point about the time that this kind of embedded trust takes to build is that with community work, most people move too fast. So let's bring this to a close. And first, before I make some concluding remarks, to summarise the findings from the 2 research questions, the large scale and the small scale, that I've presented. So there's been a marked population redistribution in Scotland in a context of ageing, and with varied dynamics of local age mix and geographically uneven demographic resilience, we might pay attention to the urban areas having greater potential for intergeneration resilience over time, and Stobswell perhaps being an example of that, whereas remote rural areas seeing decreased age diversity with implications for community resilience. The accessible towns and rural areas, as I've said, have increasing age diversity, but evidence of segregation and clustering within that. And from the initial insights of our case study site of Stobswell in Dundee, we can suggest 3 things that are important about the roots and relations of in-place intergenerational mixing, in that they're manifest as a byproduct rather than a focus of community work in this deprived central urban neighbourhood. They happen not necessarily or not only through interpersonal interactions. Generations alongside are also very important. And they manifest over the long term. So community building and intergenerational trust has taken place over decades in this community. And is at a point now where there are questions about how will this be sustained? So to conclude, I think that concepts of community resilient and age-friendly places will benefit from the incorporation of understandings of demographic change, which have largely been absent from those debates. Secondly, I think there's a need to extend concepts of mixing in place that emphasise the interpersonal or the demographic balance to account for the roots and relations through which intergenerational relations manifest, including living alongside and long-term nurturing of local cultures of intergenerational trust. And finally, this work has benefited from, would not be possible without, census data. So please lobby for us to keep having that, and from a mixed methods approach. Thank you very much.
Many thanks indeed, Nissa, for this fascinating talk, and congratulations to the whole team. who has been behind this work.